Martin Baumgarten was a cavalier and nobleman of the German Empire. He visited Egypt and wrote down his first-hand witnessed accounts of the Mamluks at the time before their official history was fabricated. This is what he says. The Mamluks are Christian. They baptize their children when they are born. And then he goes on giving details about the exact ritual of baptism, and later on says, and so most of the Mamluks come from various Christian nations like Germans, Albanians, Serbs, Italians, and Spanish. The Mamluks were not some sort of slaves and started ruling it, as the modern historians assure us with great authority, because the Mamluks are no longer there to object. Actually, these were Christian people who inherited the treasures of Egypt from their forefathers who made them. It wouldn't be very correct to label the Mamluks as survivors as well, because after thousands of years of war, the descendants of the survivors lost most of their knowledge. I'm not saying every Mameluk had a private flying saucer in the backyard. The loss of technology is very clearly illustrated by the devolution of building techniques, and you can see that in detail in my videos about the pyramids of Giza, and also the videos about the megaliths in America. Always in the lower layers we see much higher quality masonry, much bigger megaliths, much higher technologies being used, and the more we near the recent times, the quality gets lower and lower. It's a very gradual process, and this illustrates very well how the survivors were gradually losing their knowledge. Well, they did their best, whatever they could. It wasn't just constant years of bombing. The war was going on all fronts, and the most dangerous one was the psychological war. To wrap it up, the Mamluks didn't have flying saucers, but they knew very well who they are, who were their forefathers, and they had spiritual knowledge still in genuine form from the survivors. So let's get back to Martin Baumgarten and see how he describes Ali Bey, the factual ruler of the Mamluks that he met himself, and tells us about how he looked like. Ali Bey was around 45. His face was long and reddish. He was blond. His eyes were big and very clear. His beard was somewhat reddish and pointed. His eyebrows were dense. He was wearing Turkish outfits, and then he goes on describing his various turbans for various occasions. And this is not the only account of this sort. 18th century chronicle, written again by a person who saw the Mamluks with his own eyes, and that is Abd ar-Rahman al-Jabati. He described Osman Aga, who at that time was the so-called Turkish ruler of Egypt, as being blonde. This photograph is taken in year 1905, and these are the daughters of the Egyptian Khedive Abbas Halimi Pasha, who was remotely related to the Mamluks who were wiped out some 100 years earlier. Well, it is an illustration what is the result of a mixture between Mamluks and local Arabic population. So all these descriptions of actual contemporaries of the Mamluks portray a completely different picture of what we are currently led to believe Mamluks were, namely coming mostly from Asia, and having completely different looks, manners, and religion. The Egyptian historian Al-Min al-Holi wrote an interesting book sometime in the middle of the last century, which consisted of materials that he collected from medieval Arabic historic chronicle. The name of the book is Relations between the inhabitants of Nile and Volga in 12th through 14th century. Over there, Al-Min al-Holi quotes Mamluk Sultan who says, "We and the Tartars are of one clan and we will never renounce each other." Further, we read that the ratifications issued by the Egyptian Sultan were fully valid within the areas of Volga, and so the merchants who traveled back and forth were free from paying the duties that were imposed on outside traders. In other words, the Mamluks were treated as one's own clan in the areas of River Volga. For example, the Sultan al-Mansur Qalawun, although lived in Egypt for many years, he never found the need to learn Arabic language. His predecessor, Baybars, also needed a translator when he spoke Arabic. Hajib Ahmaz Beshtaq al-Kipchaki is one of the most famous emirs, and he did not find it suitable to use Arabic in his palace, and for that reason he also kept translators when he needed to communicate with the Arab-speaking people of Egypt at that time. As time went on, some of the survivors blended with the Arab population and accepted the Islamic faith. Others remained Christians, and those are nowadays known as or Coptic Christians. According to the official history, Egypt was freed from the oppressive Mamluks by the Western European military forces. And let's see when the Christian Western Europeans freed their Christian brothers, the Copts, in Egypt, what did they do with them? Normally, one would expect, if that situation was true, that they would rejoice meeting other similarly minded people who glorified their Lord Jesus Christ. The truth is, they didn't care about any Jesus Christ. The monasteries laid in ruins, the churches were plundered, the leaders of the clergy, no record of them. The Coptic Christianity was still pure. It still had the original message of Jesus Christ about how to modify the reality we live in with the power of our thoughts and intentions. The soldiers of the parasites quarantined the Coptic Christianity for some 50 years, waiting for one generation to die and forget the truth, and after that they kindly allow it to revive itself and resurrect again, but with changed ideology. They removed the original message of Christ and substituted it with parasitic so-called Christianity, that we are slaves, we are born sinful, we have to desperately pray and wait for somebody to to bestow mercy on us because we cannot do anything, because we are powerless, because we are slaves, and so on. The original Christ teaching was how to awaken the divine in us, those absolute powers that we possess as humans naturally, being part of God. The parasitic Christianity is here to convince us that we are powerless, that we are slaves, and we have to depend on external mercy. And while waiting for this mercy, we should pay our taxes and be good slaves. No, this is not true. God help those who help themselves. But even after the English keeping under quarantine the Coptic Church for 50 years, still they could not destroy everything, and even now the Copts remember very interesting stuff. The ideology of the Copts is so near to what we can find out about the ideology of ancient Egypt by reading the hieroglyphic texts on whatever has survived from the temples and other buildings. And that is why even official researchers call the Coptic ideology direct continuation of the ancient Egyptian. But how is that possible? That ancient Egyptian culture supposedly existed a few thousand years ago, and the Copts are very, very recent Christians. As I explained earlier, one of the prime instruments in fabrication of the fraudulent history was to drive important events in culture way back in the past to make them look unimportant and irrelevant to us. The kingdoms of the Egyptian pharaohs were also artificially shifted to the faraway past, but in reality the last pharaohs were Christian themselves. Christ appeared in the already rotting from within society of the survivors to restore the truth. That is why the original pure Christianity was popular amongst the various cultures all around the globe, of whom the survivors were bedrock. And there is no wonder that we see Christianity amongst the last pharaoh kingdoms of Egypt. Mainstream historians are persistently trying to hide the very obvious and clear connection between the Copts and the pharaohs, and the ambiguous phrases like, for example, they say the magical and medicinal literature of the Copts is a direct continuation of the ancient Egyptian one. And now I would like to read to you a direct quote of some of those magical texts. Hor, hor, for, El Eloi, Adonai, Yahweh, Savov, Michael, Jesus, help us and our homes. Amen. This is what they classify as magical text to cover up the connection between the last pharaohs and the Copts. This is one of the items in the burial of Tutankhamun. Is there any need of commentary? Well, this is a Christian cross. Here is the same in close-up. This is the dagger of the pharaoh, decorated with animals that are from Europe. Everybody knows that many of the ancient Egyptian paintings, or maybe at this point we should stop calling them ancient, but since they are famous as being ancient, excuse me if sometimes I still say that by mistake. So those are full of crosses, and if somebody still doubts that those crosses by chance look like Christian crosses, here on this one you can see the Christian cross in its exact form above the head of the third figure. This is obviously so-called ancient Egyptian painting. This is not from the time when supposedly some ancient Egyptian temples were subsequently converted into churches, as the mainstream historians cunningly try to convince us. Here is another Christian cross that they have forgotten to hide, and it's still visible amongst the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic signs. And this is another one laying there in the corner in one of the ancient Egyptian temples. Two ancient Egyptian statues with Christian crosses on their back. And these are Coptic images. The crosses are very, very similar to the Egyptian crosses. Here are a few more Egyptian Ankh crosses. And so, sometime in the end of the 18th century, some Jesuits are being sent to Egypt to start fabricating the future image of ancient Egypt as we know it nowadays, and which is absolute historical fiction. Remember earlier it was exactly Jesuits who took a very active part in fabricating the books that would serve as the basis of the fictional history during the Reformation period. Egyptology as science started existing very, very late in the 19th century. At that time, the Scaliger version of history was already widely accepted as scientific, and the Egyptologists were forced to adjust everything to fit those mistaken axioms that were laying the basis of the timeline of Scaliger. And if they would disagree with the Scaliger timeline, they wouldn't be employed as official scientists anymore, very much like today actually. It is very easy to maintain the false myth that the timeline of Scaliger is the only scientific one, with the simple practice of removing all those who do not agree with Scaliger. They are unlisted as scientists, and in this way, only those who agree remain. And yes, then it is true, almost all scientists do agree with Scaliger. Sometimes so-called ancient sources are quoted to support the Scaliger-Petavius timeline of Egyptian history. However, please be aware that, for example, the most famous of them, the work of Manethon, is not available in original nowadays. And so if you see some quote from Manethon, well, it is very easy to manufacture all of that, to fabricate it, because the original is no longer available. So you can put any fantasy and label it as coming from Manethon, no problem. And so is the situation with all other so-called ancient sources. As far as the official history of the various dynasties and times of rule, of reign of various pharaohs, that was easily fabricated by Henry Bruch, who approached the matter in a very practical way. He took various lists from the temple carvings. Some of them definitely were names of pharaohs. Others was not sure, but he took some lists that he liked, and also assuming, according to his liking, that those were only pharaohs. Others, they didn't fit so well, so declared them mythical, mythology, and did not include them. And then to fix easily the dates of their reign, he just decided that everybody has ruled 33 years, or to be more exact, 100 years for every 3 pharaohs. And that is how this full history was cooked and was ready to be served to the public as science. Egypt was one of the most important centers of the culture of the survivors. Over there, the knowledge of the magical abilities of the humans was kept alive until few hundred years ago by Copts and Mamluks, and that is why it was very important for the soldiers of the parasites to distort the Egyptian history in such a monstrous way. And so people are confused. There is one thing in the history books, but the actual artifacts point towards completely different story, and they don't know what to think. Did aliens build all this? Because according to history we could not have built them. We were barely coming out from the monkeys. It is absolutely possible, and indeed even likely, that aliens participated in building some structures, like, let's say, the Great Pyramid, because when we had our astral vision still working before it got disabled by our beliefs in the parasitic propaganda that we are slaves and helpless, we became slaves and helpless and lost our vision. Very few of us nowadays can see the real faces of the parasites, and we cannot see as well the divine and magnificent residents of this universe, of which the human race was originally part of.